Thanks to download. Before we start this episode, it'd be great if you could rate the podcast on Spotify or iTunes or wherever you get your podcast from, as this helps me know how we're doing and also brings it to the attention of potential listeners. One way you can support the podcast is via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes. This does what it says in the tin, and for the price of a coffee, you can help with the running costs of producing the pod and also helping to buy new gear. As an example, by the time you hear this, I'll return from a trip to Northern Ireland where we walked the ground in Londonderry and South Armagh to record a podcast called Return to Op Banner, and this will be out at the end of December. And for this, we use a portable recording device funded by listener contributions. So a quick shout out to all those who have helped out over the last few years, and to those recent coffee buyers, Johnny R. Hayes, an anonymous supporter, Guy D, Paul Bennett, John, Geordie Wills, Jonathan Kempster and Keith and Ali. So thanks to everybody there, much appreciated. On this episode I talked with Patrick Berry, a former Royal Irish Regiment officer who joined the army in 2005 and spent 5 years in uniform, including a tour in Helmand province in 2008. We discussed the complexities of counter-insurgency warfare and the leadership and ethical challenges during this type of operation. We examined the phenomenon of warrior culture, accountability in military leadership, the corrosive effect of combat on soldiers, and the need or otherwise for moral soldiering by liberal democracies fighting an enemy who are not hindered by such ideals. Paddy is now an academic and a senior associate professor in security at the University of Bath and a UK Research and Innovation Future Leaders Fellow specialising in counter-terrorism and warfare. His areas of expertise include counter-terrorism transformation and capacity building, military operations, the British Army Reserve, military logistics, the Second World War, NATO and Irish military service. He regularly provides expertise on security matters to both global and national media. Let's crack on. Thanks for coming to the podcast, Paddy. Can you start off by telling us when you joined the army, what made you enlist, and why you chose the Royal Irish Regiment?
Cheers, Colin. Great to be on, and a big fan of the pod as well. So, keep up the good work. First part, when did I join the army? In April 2005, I think I started Sandhurst, and I did about 5 years, just under 5 years. Motivations to join, I mean, like intrinsic, having looked at this, like I'm now an academic, so looking at this and the cohesion angle, intrinsic motivations, the challenge, the idea really for me, I think, to see if I could do it, prove myself, I think. I had family members who'd been in the British Army and served with distinction. I mean, like the first Marines, on my mum's side of the family, the San Nazar raid. My granny lived through the Blitz. Obviously, you can hear I'm got an Irish accent, so I'm half Irish, half English, really. And my mum's side of the family lived near older shots, so I remember going to like the Power Museum when I was about 8, and the poor lads on the gate nearly jumping out of their skins when they found out, where are you from? Oh, my mum said, we're from Dublin. They're like, well, there's a recce going on. Yeah, like, geez, fair play to them. They didn't actually freak out, drill us. But anyway, it was kind of there in the background, and I always wanted to do it. And then I had the choice going, like, I was going for an Irish Army cadet, which they take about, at the time, it's changed now, they took about like 20 Army cadets a year out of an intake of 30. Very competitive. I didn't have any background in the Irish military, knowing, and it's quite smaller, it's a bit smaller. And I had the choice there, and I came like 6th reserve. I'd gotten a bit of trouble when I was a teenager, so we could understand why they wanted to wait another year. And then I had a mate who'd been in skill. One was in the Powers, one was in the Royal Irish, and they're kind of like, look, if you want a soldier, this is, 2003 Iraq, Afghan. The British Army was on a roll, we had peace-ish in Northern Ireland that had ended pretty well in terms of a coin approach. Sierra Leone, Kosovo, Bosnia, it seemed like, it was, to be honest with you, at that time it was the best army in the world, it looked like. And so we had that choice of doing stuff, and I thought, yeah, I'll go for it. But essentially it was about this idea of a wait, or I got the offer from Sandhurst, come now, and I was like, right, let's go.
you joined in '05. It was my last 2 years of my 22-year engagement. And it's funny you use the term there, the British Army was on a roll. It's weird because that was a sort of a hubristic time for the British Army, I think, because I went on Telic 1, and that, to me, was when all the cuts and everything else started to really appear to me, based on my previous operational tours, Northern Ireland, Granby, all the rest of it. And I just think it's really weird now that you had all those people joining up to fight because we were in a decent fighting couple of wars. But then really that's when the British Army was on the turn. Everybody's now talking about the state of the British Army, but I think you can trace it back to the early 2000s quite easily.
Yeah, well, options for change had started to kick in. I mean, you could spin it the other way and go, when did the British Army never deployed a formed division to Northern Ireland? More like brigade ops. So you wouldn't have got a sense of like what was doable and what was not. But yeah, certainly if you go back to the 80s when you were in Colin, like an ex-liner and stuff like that. I mean, I talked to my friend, Professor Tony King, about this, when was it the best? And he sort of said, obviously, end of the Second World War, 45, pretty serious fighting force. Mid-80s, post-Falklands, morale up, but still got the sort of proof of concept done in Lionheart. And then he thought around actually 2011 as a professionalised, smaller fighting force in Afghan, getting into the groove of coin and getting that much more right, than I had been in the early stages, and still being able to scrap. So yeah, I think there's kind of three ways to think about when was it its best in the last 70, 80 years or so.
So what operational tours did you do then?
I'm a one-tour wonder. So I did.
Yeah, but I did. Don't do yourself, Paddy, don't do yourself down there. It was a hell of a tour.
I did Sangin, Helmand 2008. I mean, it was different to the break-in battles that Paris did a couple of years ago, and loads of mates from my regiment were backfilled into them and served in Sangin then, and Mustakala, etc., and took a good few casualties. And then our tour, was a bit different. It wasn't, they weren't doing the full-on frontals. They switched to IEDs, a huge amount of IEDs, and still the contacts. And then the lads who came afterwards, the rifles, they got the worst of it. It was towards the end of our tour, it was turned into a low-density minefield, but those ones got really walloped. I think the worst tour was like winter 2009 or something. Yeah, we were just like, thank God we're getting out of here. When looking back, I think, actually my CSN stint, I think you've got a bit of PTSD. I was like, no, but like I probably did looking back. And I'm done with it, So you went from like the bar, the barbed wire around the barracks, kind of like to keep at the time, the terrorists out, and then you're like, this is just keeping me in. So time to go. I would have done it for free. And at the end, I was like, couldn't pay me enough. So yeah, maybe it was something to do with the old mental state at the time as well.
There's that old phrase, isn't it? It's often churned out, you love the army more than the army will ever love you. And I think that's always the case. But then you can fall out of love and get divorced, can't you?
You can, yeah. The Royal Irish is an interesting there. It was also a bit of a culture. The captains doing tours and leaving for a while, and it stopped. So a lot of my contemporaries, my cohort were leaving ahead of me and behind me. So if all your mates are leaving, you're kind of like, oh, well, it's well too. Yeah.
You entered there, you're currently in academia. So what are you doing now as an academic?
Well, I'm a reader, so that sounds like pretty junior, but it's an almost prof, not quite prof, at the University of Bath. So it is I specialise in counter-terrorism and warfare. That's in the last 7 years now, just on the 7th anniversary of Bath. It's a good spot to work. Good students, great colleagues, so enjoying it.
This pod has come out for two reasons. And firstly, I heard you on a podcast where you mentioned that an estimated 2% of soldiers in the infantry were psychopaths, and that figure is likely to be higher in special forces units. And we'll discuss that later on. And second, I read a book called Ground Truth, The Moral Component in Contemporary British Warfare, which is a collection of essays centred around several themes such as legal and moral accountability and the realities of combat. And I'll put a link into that book later on in the show notes because it's basically driving this conversation. The main thrust of the book is that an ethical approach to soldiering is essential, not only because unethical behaviour could strategically be counterproductive, but also because it's inappropriate for a liberal democratic society at war. It argues that the function of the military profession is the management of violence in the service of the state. Therefore, soldiers of all ranks owe a profound duty of accountability to the state and its people for privileges like carrying arms. Finally, that soldiers as citizens are still subject to the rule of law, combining with the principle, which is central to the British approach to COIN, of the use of minimum force. It's a difficult subject, this, because it provokes a binary reaction in soldiers and civilians alike. There's a reluctance amongst many to believe allegations of misconduct by the UK military, or the notion amongst soldiers that war is war, and they should be allowed to do what is required to defeat an enemy, often when they're fighting an opponent who, unlike them, faces no constraints like rules of engagement and the Geneva Conventions. The book further argues there is a general willingness to believe the enemy is always capable of atrocities, while allegations against UK forces are dismissed out of hand. So this tendency to view our own as good and the enemy as bad suits everyone from politicians to higher command and the public too. My first question, and the one that is posed in the book, is: must liberal democracies compromise their values in order to defeat a counterinsurgency?
Quite the question, and the hedging answer is it depends. It depends on a few things. This is all, it's a very nuanced conversation. You can unpick different pieces of it, hopefully. But I think it also depends. You'd have to define what do we mean by liberal democracy? What are the values there? Is it the rule of law, and then into sort of the rules of war, ROE, proportionate use of force? Is that what we're talking about? You could say one of the principles of US coin in Afghan was give them stuff and they'll like us. Is that actually what we're talking about? We're talking about like Western liberal democracies. So it's a complicated one, isn't it, Colin? And look, I think there's two things. What I noticed about and sort of reading around conflict later in the coin era, which is what we're, I think, talking about here, is that we went to war as per what policy was in our capitals. And I think to some degree we still do, by the rules and the constraints and the political investment and will of the capital is very, very far removed from what is achievable and understood in, say, Helmand, even Kabul. Kabul is even totally different from Helmand and Kandahar. So, there's a mismatch between where the rubber meets the road. And this is really what we're talking about, is that grey area, and how do you get the best results while you've got some sort of constraint. I totally agree personally on and this isn't even a fully formed position really, but I totally agree on the need for leadership, on ethical constraint, the proportionality of the use of force, etc. But what happens when you go to a place where you probably shouldn't be there because the people hate you? So that would probably be like 50% of the people hate you. That's probably the first thing. Make sure if you're going to send people into harm's way that you're going to do where you actually have it 75% of the people are on side of you're fighting 25% of them and need to keep them away, not 50-50. What's the point of being there? So first one there. Second one, that if you're fighting in a place like Afghan, to a lesser degree in Iraq, but certainly in Afghan where we were, people respect strength. It's a brutalized society. It's been brutalized for years. There's no point pretending otherwise. People respect strength. So if you go around and look, we were strong in ticks and stuff like that. I remember just talking to the locals and they couldn't believe that we weren't tougher, essentially. And they thought it was actually a conspiracy, as they often do, that part of the world. But I thought it was a conspiracy between Bush and the Taliban.
That's an interesting point to take, because when you look at the media over here, one of the things that are always sort of on the left is that disproportionate use of force. So if you are, say, engaged from a compound and then you drop some ordnance on that compound, wiped it out, killed some of the locals, from your experience on the ground then, would that just be accepted as by some of the locals in the surrounding area that was just what happens in war when your people are fighting?
I mean, they weren't happy, of course, and there's a terrible human cost to that, as we know, but there's a realism and a toughness about them. So if a family member is killed and they come looking for recompense, essentially cash, but there's no recourse to them for anything else. This is a broken state. What are they going to do? Go to the court, International Criminal Court? It's not Switzerland. But that again is kind of a reflection of the place you're in. It's a tough place. So I think a better understanding going forward I definitely think from policymakers about, are we going to war in our image, or are we going to war in an image that people over there will understand? That's the question. Now, you don't have to put your troops into that position if you get the actual deployment and put the coin where coin should be happening and forget the other place, right. That's the other question. And that doesn't preclude, you can have this idea of, right, these guys respect force, but we still have to be proportionate and ethical about what we do. But it's about having a wider sense of what your action is. It's in that book, War from the Ground Up, by Neil Simpson, your interpretation of what you're doing. I don't know if you know this story. Do you know it, Colin? Like, where you talk about this Afghan patrol, and you go out and you go to your net, like essentially a village on the flat, and you do some medical engagement, and then on your way back, you go past that, you get into a fight with the Taliban on the edge of the village, and then you withdraw back, and like your platoon commander writes up the report. Went out, did a reassurance patrol, gave out some medical aid, got to fight the Taliban, kept them back from the flat, and it's all good. That's the report that goes up. And then if you ask the kid or a young adult in the village, it'd be like, yeah, these guys from like outer space gave out some medical stuff we didn't really need, and then got in a fight with my cousins and walked off. Yeah. So like, you got to kind of fine tune what you're doing, I think, and make sure it's understood better. But I don't have all the answers.
I think it's always been that. I don't know who first said this, but it's that one that's always trotted out in coin. In order to save the village, we had to destroy it. I think that first.
Yeah. And that was a US major in Vietnam, and it wasn't said tongue in cheek, but it also happened in Wishtown, which was, what was it, like the north area over the 611 of sort of northeast, and they flattened us, absolutely flattened us in the end, just like completely explosives and bulldozers and everything. So,
from my perspective as well, you've got the guys on the ground are doing the hard fighting, and there's always that mismatch between the political expectations and the reality on the ground. We didn't lose any tactical fights in Afghanistan, but we were beaten strategically. Again, reminds me of another saying I read in a book where an American, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but an American general after the Vietnam War goes back out to Vietnam, and he meets a Vietnam officer, an NVA officer who is fighting in the same area. And the American officer says to the Vietnamese, "Do you know you never once beat us tactically in the field?" And the Vietnamese guy goes, "That's true, but it's also relevant." You could apply that to Afghanistan as well.
It comes down to me as the odd plan. Look, it's easy, hindsight 2020. But, the decision to go to Helmand into Sangin in particular, pretty much due by politics, And it's hilarious because Karzai said, "He who controls Sangin controls Afghanistan." And everyone's like, "Oh, right," I think at the time, we must go in there. This is really important then, support the governor in 2006. And then actually what he was saying was apocryphal, It was basically like, if you can control Sangin, then you can control the whole of Afghanistan, because Sangin is so hard to control. I think that was the point he was saying. For me, look, it'd be, if you're redesigning that campaign, you'd go, these areas, we don't care. We don't actually care about the territorial integrity of Afghanistan as a state. It doesn't really exist. It never has. But what we do care is about keeping these tribal areas on side with some lay down and make their quality of life much better. And the other places, if you don't want to be a part of this Switzerland in the Hindu Kush, good luck to you. But we will keep the reach to do the CT mission consistently and make your lives hell.
Moving on then to a bit about what you already alluded to about leadership on the ground, and the book itself identifies bad behaviour as a product of toxic leadership. And just to sort of reiterate, in the book it basically argues that legal and moral judgment should be a part of fighting any coin operation. How you do that on the ground is quite difficult, and that's why we're moving on to this next one. Because a captain, you wrote an essay that appeared in the 2014 edition of Developing Leaders, a British Army Guide, on your time in Operation Afghanistan. It was called Pointing North, an essay on platoon leadership. And it was subheaded, and this is a great line: "The platoon is the gun, the platoon sergeant the bullets, and you're the safety catch." You then went on to write, "There's a balance to be struck between morality and operational effectiveness, between softness and hardness. It's a fine line to walk, but one which must be walked nonetheless. My platoon sergeant would always strive to keep the soldiers sharp, aggressive, and ready to fight their way out of any situation. I would rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6 was his watchword at our platoon discussions on rules of engagement scenarios." He was completely right, and the robustness he bred into the platoon, especially at the psychological level, would stand it in good stead during the most testing parts of the tour. However, as a junior officer, I felt the need to morally temper what the platoon sergeant has said to the men. His could not be the final word on the subject. So, Paddy, how did you negotiate that fine line?
Well, I think, that's mentioned in, Sergeant PJ there, another Kildare man who ended up as RSM. But that sort of indicates that, that's actually happened, and it happened regularly, and we'll be sitting around the platoon area in the back of the donkey bed in the DC and Sangin. And then when the intel would change and the ROE might be kind of need to be discussed about how we're going to do these things, we just did it. We sat down and we talked through scenarios with the platoon, all of them there. What would you do if this happens? What do you do if that happens? Because the whole lot, as you well know, Colin, the whole lot is and in the grey areas between ROE. And especially as the platoon got, much more slick, once you're 3 months in, the ground, you know what to do, you've been in a few contacts, etc., had a good few ideas. Like the platoon and the corporals can run itself, like tactically, like they know what they're at. But the place where they're looking for you and the leadership is the boss's interpretation of the ROE given the changing intel. So, I'll give you an example. I remember we did this, there's always 3 suicide bombers in the fucking bazaar, isn't there? But that was the intel. I mean, it was probably fresh at the time, and we're walking in this, we're sort of channeled in this alleyway. And then one of the gunners is coming through, and I don't have eyes on this. One of the point men is like, boss, there's 3 burkas coming. Oh, yeah, sorry, and I forgot to mention they're going to be wearing burkas, etc. 3 burkas coming towards us down the thing. What do I do? What do I do? And you're like, oh, shit, you can't even see it. And I would just quickly go, the chances of them sending 3 of them all at once at the one location seems completely bizarre to me. I let them through, and this guy was pretty freaked out, as he would be, as they walk. It's just kids. Teenagers, and they're even like giggling through the kneecap, looking at your man's big muscles. So there's this sort of humanity of the whole thing. But it was those kind of things. That's where they were looking for, is the grey area, the interpretation. And I mean, and you have to balance that with risk and the mission. If you're in a different kind of mission, you could just shoot people dead. If that's a conventional war, obviously the threat would be slightly different. So that's what I found you're balancing through. And obviously your ROE sometimes really annoying, as people well know, guys with AK-47s under their dish dash, basically dicking you for ages and calling in mortars. And, the proof of being able to engage the Americans be a bit more relaxed that way. So, and that's the kind of thing you did feel like cumulatively after a while. You're like, is this taking us for a bit of a ride? I mean, maybe we can lean into this a bit more. But generally, if you build up a picture, you could get clearance for certain threats.
Was you to know when McChrystal's Courageous Restraint piece came out, or was that before?
No, it was before. I mean, they did start to cut the kind of firepower we could use inside the more, towards the end of our tour, inside the more built-up areas. But it wasn't hadn't got to the point of Courageous Restraint. So yeah, I just think it's a hard path to tread, and you've got to work at it. You've got to work at the morality aspect versus the toughness. To zoom this out to special forces who are executing policy at the tactical level, it's even more extreme, and they need to be more robust too. So there's no easy answers, but I just think it is something that good leaders work at and imbue by their personality. This come back to your toxic leadership, imbue by their personality about what's acceptable and what's not. I had a corporal who was actually a vet in 2006, and towards the end of the tour, getting casualties and starting to lose people. We were lining up to go out the gate, and he goes, so he had a lot of kudos, these experienced lads with far more gongs than I had, and he just steps out, and all the platoon are in the line, he steps out and goes, boss, what are we doing? What are we doing here? What's this for? This is a waste of fucking time. At the point, it was pretty, it was basically advanced ID, try to find it, wait for ages, maybe get contacted on the board. And I remember the whole platoon going quiet and looking at, oh, this is going to be interesting. And I just said to him, I said, look, I get where you're coming from. This isn't what I thought it was going to be like either, because we all thought we were going to Afghans 2006, all that kind of jazz. And it had changed. I mean, there was a bit of that, but it had certainly changed towards the end of the tour. And I was just like, look, Corporal, we signed up for this. This is different from what we thought it was. I understand that, but you're a professional soldier in the Royal Irish Regiment, and we're going to do the best in the job that we can while we're out here, and you can sign off when you get back. And he looked at me and he went, all right, boss. Do you know what I mean? It's about kind of, the message was though, like, this is what it is, whether we like it or not, and we'll do it as best we can.
The British Army has carried out war crimes. It happens in war. I remember my grandfather tell me he wouldn't go into anything in specifics, but he fought in the Second World War. And he turned around and said, I saw stuff by British soldiers that was equal to what the Germans were doing. And that happens in war. I think, again, the leadership aspect is quite interesting, because if you look at things like My Lai, or My Lai, however you pronounce it, with William Calley,
it's a great study that, because if people aren't aware, in 1968, Paddy took his company or his platoon into a Vietnamese village, and there was 500 people killed. Great aspect of that was there's another warrant officer called Hugh Thompson was flying around in a helicopter supporting the operation, and he saw it was going down. He landed and he tried to put a stop to it. But again, when this is going to feed into further on a conversation about accountability, Paddy was court-martialed. He got a few years house arrest. Thompson was sort of ostracised, and his career came to a bit of a grinding halt because of his actions that day. I just want to go on about accountability, really, because it seems to me whenever you're looking at the things that are happening on operations, the shit rolls downhill, for want of a better phrase. And it was Patton that said, a general officer who invariably assumes responsibility for failure, whether he deserves it or not, and invariably gives credit for success to others, whether they deserve it or not, will achieve outstanding success. And you look at what happened in Camp Bastion, where the Taliban attacked it in September 2012. They destroyed a number of aircraft. Britain was responsible for the security of that base. There were 2 United States Marine Corps generals deemed responsible from the US side, and they were forced to retire. But no UK senior officer was held responsible. And post that incident, a US Marine Corps officer said about the Bastion incident, the fusing of accountability and responsibility is what makes Marines effective leaders and followers. Why is the UK military so relaxed about this lack of accountability among senior officers? And what should we be doing about it, if anything?
Yeah, it's a good question. I was doing some research about Future Reserves 2020 when it came out, and I had to look at, obviously in detail about the 2009 cuts, which really started to really gut the Army and the rest of the armed forces, but in particular the Army. And during that, I went to have a look at so there was always some discussion about whether the head, as there is often, whether the head of the Army would resign, during the cuts, and that was General Wall at the time, and we've had the same with General Sanders. There were some reports of that might happen, and no head of the Army, as far as I could aware, had resigned since the Curragh Mutiny of the 1920s, and there had been one head of the Navy resigned in the 60s, apparently so, over cuts and age. I mean, compare that with in the US, generals resign. Yeah, that's basically a culture there. Being caught out, they're constantly being relieved. You look what's going on in the Pacific Fleet, for example. So they've got that accountability aspect, I think, more finely tuned. And in France, when the heavy cuts came in 2012 under, who would have that been? Either Sarkozy, I think, potentially Helmand, the head of the armed forces resigned over the cuts. So I think that's the thing. I think it's become culturally, there's a lot of reasons these guys have their teams around them. Well, what happens if you resign? What kind of difference will it make? Yada, yada, yada. The point is, it's a marker, especially in the UK example, a chief of service resigning would be a big deal because no one has in so long. I'm in much more favour. I think people should be on gone. Good luck. We've seen tranches of brigadiers resign 2009-10 when they saw and that was all the future Army leadership. They could see the writing on the wall. This is going to be a cluster. And it was. What we have seen is we are seeing more senior generals being reprimanded recently and cashiered, etc., for conduct, which is unusual. But it's a slightly different question, that is. And I suppose that we're talking about the higher level, so basically a kind of resigning for political effect and on a point of principle about what is sustainable for force design. To get back to the Cali kind of question, which was horrendous. If you look at these, there's so many, there's obviously a history of atrocities in Western forces, and like your granddad said, both sides do it. History is written by the winners. We just don't hear it as much. But there's always these same things. You always get pretty much dodgy leadership at the tactical level, right? Someone that either wasn't that good or has always been too gung-ho, not really kind of got the balanced kind of thing. Nearly always the units taking casualties. Often they're left on their own. There's a breakdown of kind of looking after them and making sure they're okay. And sometimes they're overexposed. They haven't been rotated. there's usually, look at black hearts, like it's almost exactly the same. Oh, sometimes it's just a bad egg, like, you know, and influences the others because they're left on their own. Like you get into these kind of really quite detailed intergroup dynamics where certain personalities start to influence more. The thing is, whether you're infantry, whether you're special forces, I think people start to think that they're embodying the kind of warrior ethos or whatever, and this is good for them and good for the unit. And because they're so close to the front, they don't take a step back and go, Jesus, what? This is actually potentially catastrophic for my unit. Completely catastrophic. This unit could be, because of my actions, this could be the end of my unit. We've seen it with Canadian Airborne. That's it. You're gone, you know? And it makes sense. I actually totally agree with that. It's like, if you cannot sustain the regimental ethos, get that balance right between hardness and legal and morality and ethics.
No,
your leadership is a bunch of officers, and your leadership is a bunch of officers and NCOs can't get that right. Why should you exist? You brought shame, and you know, and that's the other thing. You brought shame on a regiment that's 400 years old.
I think you bring out some good points there, and I think the Marine A, the Sergeant Blackman incident, where he was convicted for killing a wounded Taliban, it makes a very interesting outline to a lot of what we've discussed so far there, and what actually does the army want in leaders? Because on that tour, you had 4-2 Commando with Lieutenant Colonel Murchison, and then you had Lieutenant Colonel Oliver Lee with 4-5 Commando, who were operating in the Nada Ali area. And they took two very different approaches. Murchison had a non-finesse approach, and Lee wanted to reduce violence. And Lee did much groundwork pre-tour with his operational design, which is set out in length in the Ground Truth book. And he wrote, however justifiable are kinetic actions, the resultant Afghan funerals will generate brothers and cousins bent on revenge. He went on to note, we will maintain our discipline always, and in every eventuality there is no place, for example, for feral soldiering because of austere conditions. High standards will win. And David Petraeus later wanted to describe his commandos work as PhD level counterinsurgency. And
whatever that
means. Yeah, I know. That's people just.
Yeah, I hate that stuff. PhD level, master's. I was like, come on.
But Petraeus would say that, wouldn't he? Because he was the architect of
exactly.
That.
Yeah. He's not going to say it's airborne level, is he? Well, he might.
Yeah. But I think it's interesting that, going back to my premise of shit rolls downhill, Blackman was court-martialed. That unit, if you read into the outline of what's going on there, going back to what you said about it was out on its own, nobody visited it, they were left to their own devices, essentially. There was no accountability there.
Question mark over its leadership.
Yeah, and the Taliban were hanging bits of Marines and trees, that type of thing. Nobody else apart from Blackman was held to account. His CO, who had the more aggressive approach, later went on to future promotion. And Lee got an OBE and Murchison got a DSO. If you look at it in the levels of awards, the more aggressive approach was rewarded. So there's a load of mixed messages going on there and lack of accountability. I mean, I just wonder if you get anything you want to add to that.
Well, like, it's so hard to, because of the way this site, like, one of my research areas at the moment, someone who knows much more about this is, again, Tony King. He could tell you in detail about what he can say, about what goes on at the Marines, what went on there. But so I'm not all over that. But, like, on the medals thing, if 2 citations get put in, or an OBE is even a different kind of recommendation, isn't it? DSO is like a citation, OBE would go down a different channel. So very different kinds of way they're written, etc. And obviously, format for DSO leadership in combat is going to emphasize those things. I don't know who wrote them up or whatever. But look, there was common knowledge. There was these were career-defining tours, Afghanistan at the time. And if you had a kinetic tour, you got the tick in the. Obviously, you got the combat tick. If it was a kinetic tour, I'm not saying that you created it. It's the height of kind of your professional career in some ways. You're doing stuff and fighting, and you had an enemy that would fight you. But I do think that became a sort of, what would you call it, like a sort of subtext of what was happening. That people felt that, oh yeah, you got in a scrap, well, I'm going to go out and get a scrap too. If we're going to go to an area where we might well get a scrap. Whereas the other approach is kind of like, look, we need to dampen this whole thing down. There was a difference in the recognition to that of for whatever reason. I don't really have the answer, really, Colin, about it, apart from sharing those thoughts. The black man thing, like, shit rolls down. Yeah, but he's still culpable. He's also that team. Like, what are you doing filming it? What are you doing keeping it after you're filming it? You know?
Yeah.
I mean, the whole thing, what do you do? Why did you do it, first of all? Having been a soldier, you can understand the situation where you come across a very badly wounded person. And I know it's illegal even for soldiers to do this again, but even your own comrades, you could have, there are situations where people would say, and you see it in Russia the whole time. I mean, that's to do with reparations for the dead, but there were situations where you'd hope potentially, you know, if it was you, it would be done to you by a friend. And they had the case of the Canadian captain who was, cashiered, tried, and then reinstated, or I can't remember exactly, for doing something similar. I mean, certainly though not with the shuffling off this mortal coil and filming it aspect present. So
when you turn around to a camera, a head cam, and say, I'm breaking the Geneva Convention, and that's presented evidence, you're not leaving people much headroom. But no. I do find it a bit disturbing.
Exactly. Like what?
I do find it disturbing, though, that there's no, whether you like it or not, your soldiers under your command are your responsibility. And, you know, the fact that, yes, it was black and white with black men dead, but I just find it a bit puzzling that there's no, that's it, he's just compartmentalised like that. Later on, mitigating circumstances came into it, and that's why he got his sentence reduced. But I still think there is a lack of accountability there for people in charge of black men that I find puzzling, if I'm honest.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And I don't know the ins and outs, and I would be careful kind of what you're saying here. But yeah, like I would be then looking at like, right, what was going on?
Yeah,
you know, what's the context in the subunit essentially?
Yeah. And it's difficult. We weren't there. We don't know. You often hear it. You weren't there. You didn't serve in Afghanistan. You have no right to comment. And I think that's a very limiting thing to say to people, because I think otherwise people with different experiences wouldn't be able to commentate on anything if you weren't there.
Yeah. Look, I think what seems to be quite important is the company level in an infantry unit. It's especially with dispersed operations and you're operating out of a FOB. You know, that a lot comes out of the personality and subunit culture, command culture set by the OC and his team to a degree. Now that embodies it, and if someone is leaning into it and thinks that this is what they're going to do, and they, you know, some stuff is coming out about some of the squadrons with SF potentially, certainly in Australia, and there's obviously ongoing investigations, but in the UK, you know, that where someone comes in with with a different culture, is we're going to lean into this, we're going to get a culture, we're going to get these kills, yada yada yada. Well, what you're doing is you're opening the area, you know, the space within which the likelihood of something going catastrophically wrong for people is. What I would be doing is really instead of leaving it in my day to kind of like officer training and to muse on this in discussions, I'd be getting into the real weeds of this, like at junior level, at NCO, junior officer level, at sort of senior NCO level, mid-ranking officer levels to other people. So you work at it, and people get an understanding, okay, this is how it might pull me this way, and I might think that this is the right thing to do, but actually and ultimately I think if you come back to this risk to your regiment, which is very emotive to most people who've served in it, they don't want to see that done down. They want to be effective, they want to be professional. They definitely don't want to see their regiment disbanded over something they did. My
next statement, I'm in danger of comparing apples with pears, but I remember we did a tour in London during 89, and two of the lads were killed in an ID strike, and several others badly wounded, life-changing injuries. And the phrase I'll use is, the blood was up, you know, in a small unit.
Yeah, all right.
And our sergeant major sensed this and got round everybody and laid the law down that we would not take it out on the local population.
Yeah,
And I often think back, if he hadn't have done that, you know, what would have happened? I'm not saying soldiers would have killed people, but I certainly reckon a lot. People would have got a bit of a slap in, that type of thing. So I think that ability for the command level to sense what's going on in their own unit and grip it is highly important.
That's leadership, and that's understanding, and it's a management of violence, essentially, which is what their jobs are.
Yes. Yeah. You touched on it earlier, Paddy. You used the phrase warrior culture, and in the last 15 years, we've seen the rise of that warrior culture. And in the main in Britain, it's been copied from the United States. And it's evident in a variety of ways, such as bodybuilding, up massive. British used to be quite skinny blokes that could run fast. Americans used to be quite big blokes that couldn't. You know, the aping of US language, unit patches like Spartan skulls, people copying the SF operator look with the hero sleeves and beards. Do you think warrior culture, if it exists, is a bad influence on how people conduct themselves in operations, or is it just like there's always been alliness there, and this is just another phase of it?
There's a difference between alliness, which is professionalism, and being squared away and having good kit, and what some positive elements of warrior culture, and then the toxic element. And again, it's something to be worked at. Like, some of it is okay, but some of it is crossing the line. I think it's about finding what that balance is. You want your small units to be as cohesive as possible. You don't want them, what we call deviant cohesion, when cohesion switches from being towards the ultimate organizational, so unit, and then institutional military army goals. Yeah, when it crosses over, that's deviant cohesion. You don't want that. And that's then a deviant subculture. So you got to find the balance. But like, I remember saying, again, corporate saying to me, like, you got to have an early boss. You know what I mean? Like, get the stuff. You know what I mean? You don't want to be God around all the issues. Especially then, it was pretty dodgy, a lot of the stuff. So that's okay. No problem with that. And the warrior culture, I mean, so you say the rise of it. It's interesting. I have a friend who did a PhD on it recently, a military guy, and he kind of concluded it wasn't, if I remember correctly, it wasn't particularly applicable to the British infantry. A lot of it was imported, but nonetheless, it had resonance. To me, I think maybe it's risen and falling a little bit now. It's a bit like 2010, it seems to me, but, I'm not haloing into places, clearly. So I would have said that is something as a command or whatever level you need to keep a good eye on. And that idea of where is this going potentially beyond? Where am I creating the scope again, or allowing that margin of error for something to go catastrophically wrong? Where does that increase? And again, it's about balance. What's healthy and what's not? The point here is, and I mentioned this in my own book, killing is morally corrosive, and war over a period is morally corrosive. So you're going to get corroded. So what do you do about it as a leader? And your men are going to get corroded. Your people are going to get corroded. So how do you, again, as a manager of violence, how do you manage that? What are your strategies? What are you working at? Where were you on it? But I remember a little story is I remember coming back. One of my mates was like in Ranger Platoon, which was in with 3 para in the thick of things in 2006, right? And so tasty tour, and then came back. I was like totally green, second lieutenant. And I was like, so what was your biggest lesson from that 4 months of proper scrapping? And he looked me in the eye and he went, and I was expecting to say, like, in an L-shaped ambush, do this. Yeah, do you know what I mean? Like some tactical solution, like getting off it, or a hot LZ. He went, don't let your blokes lose their humanity. I was like, what? Halfway through the tour in Sangin, I was like, remember walking away, God, thinking about the platoon, Jesus, what's going on here with the dynamics? Boom. And I was like, Jesus Christ, that's the most important thing that anyone said to me. Leader is contingent too on your credibility, your aptitude, your personality, your culture, but also like on the group dynamic, you can be just pushed out if it gets too far and you're just like titular head.
I think as a young officer, it's a very difficult line to tread. And it's very, especially if you've got a platoon sergeant who is particularly headstrong or whatever. You're talking about that corrosiveness, because there's an increasingly a problem with moral trauma in people, and not just like the traditional post-traumatic stress disorder. I hate to use that word traditional, but you know what I mean. And moral trauma. I think if you have that corrosiveness, do you think if you have that corrosiveness that's not checked, that moral trauma is more likely to happen to somebody?
Not a psychologist, Colin. I think if you're able to stay cognizant of this being morally corrosive as it becomes so, of the effect of it on you, so that you're aware of it, I think that probably lessens and helps the processing of it, as it were. There's some moral trauma things that you can't avoid, like, the moral trauma of, like, losing your mate in Sangin and then watching them, the same unit who you serve with 2-Power doing the extraction in Kabul, and the people pulling themselves over the place. Like, I was in tears at one point watching it. That's, you know what I mean? Like, you can't control that. That's just like bad policy at the sort of the execution by the military of bad policy in terms of withdrawing. So there's a moral trauma between how things work out in the end at the sort of like the eventual level of whether that's Iraq. Northern Ireland probably maybe moral trauma more tactically, but because it ended in a peace process, you can maybe kind of relate to it in a slightly different way and go, okay, yeah, that was absolutely terrible, but in the grand scheme of things are certainly better than where they were in the 70s, late 60s.
I mean, the reason I asked that question, I was also being flippant, but these are all words that are thrown out now, like PhD level insurgency. I think that they're thrown out. One of the reasons I asked the question was, do I actually understand what it means? And I don't think I do. I understand that when Northern Ireland, the peace process came about, I felt betrayed. I felt my friends had been betrayed. But at least we had something to show for it. When Afghanistan folded, for Afghanistan veterans, it was even worse because there was nothing to show for it. It's gone back to where it was more or less 20 years ago.
I was just going to say, but it didn't have to end.
No, that's the thing.
From a military perspective.
And I think as well, there's a good book out there. It's called Code Over Country, The Tragedy and Corruption of SEAL Team 6 by Matthew Cole. It's a really good book in respect that corrosion that you talked about earlier on. It shows how that unit sort of was corroded on operations. And what's interesting about it is he's never been pulled up in court or had legal action taken against him about some of the allegations he makes. It's an interesting read for what I would say is not just that corrosion, but also warrior culture when it takes a grip. Anybody wanting to explore those two topics, I'd recommend Code Over Country to read it.
I really look forward to reading it. And Jim Frederick's Black Hearts is a great one. And, if there's any leaders at the moment, like you junior leaders, reading this stuff is really useful because then you go, okay, right, it's in the knowledge bank. And it might help you spot some signs.
Yeah. At the start of the pod, you mentioned that you thought 2% of infantry soldiers were psychopaths, a figure likely to be higher in the SF. Just wondering how you sort of arrived at that figure. What do you think the implications of that are?
It's a finger in the wind thing. Think about one of the first books, good to you listeners will know, like on killing. And he kind of does, all right, a 1% in the military is probably psychopath. Now, I listened to your pod with Andy McNabb, which is fascinating, functioning psychopathy versus dangerous psychopathy. My brother's a clinical psychologist. I asked him about it. He said, yeah, listen, in the general population, it's less than 1%. I think Andy said that too. So, yeah, but then you go and look, this is something from my lived experience. You go and you look at, in the infantry, in the Royal Irish, sort of air assault infantry, regular line, I would have said before, looking back, now we're talking functioning, dangerous. There's also this element which I think the army is fascinating. Like, we're so tight on medical rules and people can't join with hay fever and all this. Do we have any conception of, like, especially how we're self-selecting some of these units for autistic spectrum disorder? Do they know where they are? What are undiagnosed? Of course, if they're diagnosed, well, then they're going to struggle. But, I'm pretty sure some of these units are highly selecting people who are on that, and functioning, of course, functioning. But wouldn't you want to know, especially if they're, executing British policy at the tactical level, you'd want to know where you sit and where your blokes sit to have a better understanding. I mean, some of these teams are aware of, emotional state before they go into places. At the wider, sort of more operational, strategic level, maybe having an understanding of this. Now, I don't know, I can't speak to the level of detail of that. But I thought as I went along, and certainly as you got into the more elite infantry and working with them around the fringes, there was more, okay, of this strange behaviour and say, would be really quite out of place in a normal society. And I think we've seen this with like reintegration of forces, especially with being through combat, but those ones who've been through more and more of the sort of elite pathway of training and more aggression behaviour. And so I can only posit really But I think that as a system becomes more aggressive and more elite, in some cases, I still think it's going to be a small number, but I think it's going to be a multiple of that 1% that Grossman spoke about. So that's my kind of reasoning behind it, and certainly based with some lived experience.
I think it'd be interesting to do some comparisons, because I had a Delta Force operator, Tom Satterley, on the podcast a couple of years ago, and he was describing Delta's selection process, and they have a heavy psychological screening process. And I don't know if the SEAL teams have that either, and are people who go for Delta and fail that psychological assessment, are they siphoned out because of things we've just been talking about? I don't know. It's interesting, but
my understanding is people I've read that the people who get the teams are the ones that say, it's not like, I want to do this, I want the challenge. They're like, I want to be on the teams. I want to be on the teams. They're the ones who get through. And of course, the other one is, whether can you work in small teams? Do you have the personality to work in small teams? And obviously the resilience piece, I would be fascinated to know whether they're kind of looking at this now. And it's no problem. You want to have an awareness that you are. If you skew that way, and then you're in these incredibly high-pressured environments where you are expected to kill people repeatedly, and you already skew towards task orientation, coldness, detachedness, I mean, then again, we're talking about that margin of error where things can go catastrophically wrong. You want to have that as small as possible, no matter what unit you are, no matter what you're doing. That's the kind of understand leadership piece you want to be working the angle. And I think it's one piece that certainly, from my knowledge, open source, might need to be looked at.
No, that's interesting. I read a few years ago that, I think it was America, obviously, but they're talking about infantry units, and they psychologically profiled the company sergeant major and the OC. And what they'll do is, if they're both type A personalities, they won't put them in the same unit to get the same company together. So they'll have a type A and a type B. So they sort of, that yin and yang piece. Going back to what you're saying later on about screening people, initially I was thinking, well, you probably screen out a lot of people, but if you do it to manage people in that way, and you know who the issue is, I can see why that would be useful.
Totally. It's not like a witch hunt. It's like to have a better understanding of where we are.
I'm well out of date, you know. I mean, and I find these type of conversations for people like yourself that fought in Afghanistan quite fascinating. And I think what we need to realise is that illegal killings and war crimes happen in all wars. Sometimes they're deliberate, sometimes they're accidental, and you can't just say these things are black and white. I also think you need a framework to walk the line by, like a legal framework, but it needs to be fit and objective, and soldiers need to be supported properly. You know, you look at Blackman, yeah, he did do what he did, but I feel personally he was hung out to dry a little bit with no other accountability to take some of the weight there. And I think if you don't have that guidance, you end up becoming Kali at My Lai or the Russian forces in Ukraine. Wonder what your overall sort of summing up is there.
Well, I think, you know, riffing off your Russian forces in Ukraine, this is getting more complex. You know, what happens when you've got a civvy now who is essentially under the Geneva Convention a saboteur because they're using their phone to pass information on about military positions, you know, and are we training, or we should be, and I think we probably are training our young leaders and NCOs to deal with this situation, you know, that you've just been, your lost that has been given away and a missile strikes come in and then you go into, and you've lost blokes and you go in, what's the story there? As far as I understand, that is, I mean, you're not going to kill them, but you can arrest them and take them back and as a saboteur.
You see soldiers trying to surrender to drones. Physically impossible, and the situation impossible. Again, this has opened up a whole line of question now. That guy's trying to surrender and you smash a FPV drone into him. Is it legal? Is it illegal? You couldn't take a surrender. There's nobody there. So it's...
Yeah, some of those drones have led groups of soldiers back, apparently. But the other thing that's going on is because Russia won't pay the reparations to the war dead, or the payments to the families, so soldiers are making sure that they're seen on camera being killed.
Glad I'm a fat old civvy now, mate. You know?
Mate, I'm sure the Russians would take the two of us.
I think I could find maybe a role in the CQMS stores, but that'll be about it. You wrote a book about your time in Afghanistan called Call Sign Hades, an Irish platoon commander in the most dangerous place on the earth, and it was described by Kevin Myers, the Irish Independent, as a scintillating masterpiece. The first great book of the Afghan War. Can you just give listeners an overview of the book and where they can get a copy?
Thanks. I mean, it's an old book now. I wrote it just after I became just after I came back from the tour, I'd been asked by the regiment to write a few sort of dispatches for the Irish Times. And so I had the basis of the book there and I wanted to get out, so that's why I wrote it. And it's about our platoons in Afghanistan and some of the kind of moral, essentially about the moral maze that you go through and that kind of, and also the emotional journey. As I've sort of alluded to, I've talked about some bits from it. So, and you can get it. Where can you get it? That is a good question, Colin. Let's find out. I mean, probably on Amazon. And that's probably it, to be honest. But get one and keep it because it's going to be a collector's item. There's so few sold.
No, but I think obviously if you're discussing some of the aspects we've just discussed in the podcast here, I need to read it. It's on my list. And if you're up for it, once I do read it, is get you back on. We can have a discussion a bit more about some of the issues you raise in it.
I want to get on another pod with Andy McNabb and this SEAL team guy, and let's just talk about what are what's the story of the psychological selection. We're not going to be able to do that, but anyway.
I don't know, mate. You could maybe get Matthew Cole on, and something can maybe look at.
That'd be great too. Well, yeah.
I'll sit back and let you two do it, and I'll just sit and moderate. Well, I'll tell you what, too, mate. Read Matthew's book. When you're ready, give us a shout. I'll see if I can maybe get him on and link us up.
We've really got to read that book. It looks like right up my street.
Yeah, it's interesting. As normal, we'll finish off with Desert Island Dits, which is the guest choice of book, film, luxury item. Paddy, what's your book choice this episode?
So I'm going to keep it, on point in terms of military stuff. I mean, but I'm going to say one of the most influential military books I've read is Caputo's A Real World War, which does talk a bit of this moral maze and the corrosiveness of warfare. It's a great one.
US Marine Commander, wasn't he thinking for right, Phil Caputo?
In Vietnam.
Yeah, that was acknowledged as one of sort of the first classics in the year. I've read that years ago. It's a really good read. And film choice?
Film choice, I'm going to go again with, I think, one of probably the best war film made of the last 15 years, Kajaki.
Yeah, and that's about the guys that accidentally wander into a minefield that wasn't marked. I'll tell you what, do you know what? When you talk about when you do your leadership courses and it's like, get across that crocodile-infested river with 2 poles and a couple of sandbags or whatever. I mean, that whole thing, you watch how that unfolded, that's definitely your worst day out ever.
It is, but it's so realistic. It's just the real deal. And even to the point where some cities don't really understand us because of the VP. But I just say to people who want to know what it's like, that's what it's like. And, it was crowdfunded by soldiers from parachute regiment. So, it's authentic.
And look, Graham.
Packet of Haribo or Tabasco sauce in the top pocket.
Along with your spoon. Like in Afghan, does soldiers still carry a well-licked spoon in the pockets? Or is it all worried about...
You would have had your spork. Yeah, you would have had your spork in your top pocket just in case, you obviously had your 24-hour rations in case you got stuck. So, yeah, you would have.
My choice then is the book I've mentioned at the start of the podcast, Ground Truth, The Moral Component in Contemporary British Warfare. It's edited by Frank Ledwidge, Helen Parr and Aaron Edwards. And it won't be to everybody's taste. Some of it I agreed with, some I didn't, but it actually makes you think and raises some important questions. That's it for another episode. Thanks to Paddy for coming to the podcast, and to you, the listener, for your continued support and suggestions. Please keep them coming, and our email and social media links are at the bottom of the show notes. You can find us on all the usual suspects, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And if you download us from iTunes, like the podcast, it'd be great if you leave us a review there or anywhere you get your podcast from. Thanks again to Nick Buell for his continuing help in offering technical support for his company ISAR, and we'll see you next time on The Unconventional Soldier.